Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session on family planning. My name is Nkechi O, and I'm from the University of Ghana. Now, during this session, we are going to listen to 3 presentations. Now, after all the video presentations have been completed, we will have each paper's discussants provide comments for about 5 minutes, after which we'll open up the floor for about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. Now, I'd like to mention that during the video presentations, the attendees will be able to write questions in the written Q&A box and not the chat box. Attendees can use the thumbs up feature in the Q&A box for questions or comments that they support. And this will move the more popular questions to the top of the list, which the Q&A moderator can come back to and then pose these questions to the speakers later on. Alternatively, if you wish, you can raise your hand during the Q&A session and then pose your questions vocally. And now I'd like us to begin with the video presentations. We will have the first presentation by Catalina Herrera Almanza, and she is from Northeastern University. She is going to be presenting her paper titled Curse of the Mamiji: The Influence of Mothers-in-Law on Women's Social Networks, Mobility, and Reproductive Health in India. So can we have her presentation, please?
And Praveen Patak. Let me start by. Hi everyone, my name is Catalina Herrera and I will be presenting Course of the Mamiji, the Influence of Mothers-in-Law on Women in India. This is a joint work with my co-authors, Anukriti, Mahesh Kara and Praveen Patak. Let me start by motivating this paper. Social networks influence individuals in a myriad of ways, and this is critically important in developing countries where informal networks such as caste can offer benefits to their members. However, in traditional patriarchal societies, women may have limited ability to access and benefit from existing networks. And this might be the case because there are restrictive social norms or strategic constraints imposed by family members. So in this paper, we are going to do 2 things. The first is to characterize social networks of young married women in rural Uttar Pradesh, India, and then to analyze how intergenerational power dynamics within the household affect women's network access and formation. And we will do this by addressing 3 questions. The first is, does co-residence with the mother-in-law affect her daughters-in-law's social network? And if so, why and how does the mother-in-law exert her influence, and what are the consequences of these restrictions for the daughter-in-law? So by analyzing the role of the mother-in-law in the household, we contribute to the family economics literature by analyzing other members different from the husband on women's welfare. And we recognize that there are several descriptive studies in other disciplines that have documented the role of the mother-in-law on women's autonomy. But as far as we know, we are the first paper to explore the influence of the mother-in-law on the formation of women's networks and what are the resulting effects on their autonomy and reproductive health decisions. We also show that the misalignment of fertility preferences between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law is crucial to define family planning outcomes. And this is new because previous literature has shown this misalignment for spousal disagreement on desired fertility. We also contribute to the economics of network because despite rapid growth in research on social networks in economics in the context of developing countries, there is a limited literature on the role of gender in network formation and peer effects. And we shed light on women's networks in the domain of reproductive health, which have not received much attention in prior research. And these are interactions that are private, and then if we are able to identify what are the key players in these networks, this information is relevant for policymakers. We highlight also an underappreciated explanation for the relative sparsity of women's social network in contexts where patriarchality and restrictive social norms are prominent. So let me start by describing the data, which is key for the empirical strategy. We collected this information from 671 women from 28 villages in Jampur district during June and August of 2018. This is a baseline survey of the randomized controlled trial that aims to increase women's access to family planning services. The sample selection criteria is that we chose these women based on if they were currently married, if they were aged 18 to 30, have at least one living child, were not sterilized, and were not currently pregnant or more than 6 months of postpartum. And the idea was to target population that really need the family planning services. So as you can see in this table in the sample description, our consistent with the sample criteria, these women are relatively young and they have they are 25 years old. They have completed 9 years of education, and 68% of them live with the mother-in-law, and this is in an environment where there is low empowerment and mobility. For example, only 14% of women are allowed to go alone to the clinic, and 14% of them have worked in the last 7 days. So a key component is the social networks the model, and in this model we ask each woman to name up to 5 individuals in Jaipur besides her husband and mother-in-law, with whom she discusses personal affairs related to issues such as children, illness, schooling, health and work, and financial support, and we will call these 5 people general peers. We also ask these women with whom they share issues around family planning, fertility and reproductive health, and we call these close peers. We ask also specific information about these close peers. We also ask about interactions with husbands, mother-in-law, and other close peers outside of Jampur. And what we find is that besides their husbands and mother-in-law, our sample of women interact with very few individuals about their personal affairs or private concerns. And just to give you an idea, an average woman mentions 1.6 general peers in Jampur, which is comparable with a US woman having 8 close friends. So these are people who are kind of isolated. And these interactions are even more limited when it comes to the domains of family planning and fertility. For example, 36% of women have no close peers in Jaipur district, and the mother woman has only 1 peer. So, in fact, only 49% of our women have 1 close peer in the village. Only 24% have a close peer in the same village who is not a household member. And this is consistent with the fact that 86% of women close peers in Jampur are relative, and some of the literature has shown that women's networks have more kin ties than men's networks. The duration of these close peers is highly correlated with the marital duration, and these relationships are tied. For example, close peers have frequent communications with women. 58% of women feel very comfortable leaving their children for an afternoon with these close peers, and 50% have discussed marital problems and inter-household conflicts. And we also find that there is homophily among these relationships by caste, gender, and marital status, which we utilize in our empirical strategy. So when we analyze the influence of the mother-in-law, we are going to address 3 questions that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation by using an OLS model, where the outcome for a woman I from caste group C living in village B is going to be explained by a dummy variable for correspondence with the mother-in-law, conditioning on other community fixed effects, caste fixed effects, and other women's controls. So this first table shows us, using these OLS models, that women who live with the mother-in-law have fewer close peers. So as you can see in the table, in all of these specifications, the coefficient of the mother-in-law is negative and statistically significant, different from other members in the household. So in our preferred specification, co-residence with the mother-in-law decreases by 20% the number of close peers with respect to the outcome mean. And even this effect is larger when we analyze these close outside peers outside of the home. So these are peers with whom the woman talks about family planning and fertility, but they are not family members. Co-residence with the mother-in-law decreases by 30% the number of close peers with respect to the outcome mean. So we also find that women who live with the mother-in-law are less mobile. For example, co-residence with the mother-in-law decreases by 53% the probability of the daughter-in-law visiting the health facility alone with respect to the outcome mean. And we see similar patterns with other places such as going to the grocery store or going to the market or outside of the community. So one concern that we have in all of these results is that there might be a selection into co-residence with the mother-in-law. We analyze an extensive set of covariates in this table by co-residence with the mother-in-law, and we find that they are different by age, duration of marriage, and education, and we control for these variables in all of our models. But also we did a series of tests and robustness checks that you can see also in the paper. For example, we estimate our models to the sample when the father-in-law is co-resident. And we did so because in this environment, divorce is unlikely. So if the mother-in-law is not present, it's more likely because of her death. And as you can see in this table, the results are similar to our estimates. Even it's surprising that the effect of the mother-in-law can even on the close outside peers can be even larger. We also did similar exercises by estimating the effects on women who have been married only for 5 years. And what we can conclude is that these results can be close as causal. In this environment, it's very difficult to find a perfect instrument or quasi-experimental evidence to measure the causal effect of the co-residence in the mother-in-law, but we are confident that with these exercises, we are at least addressing certain concerns about this selection. So we also analyze why the mother-in-law will be exercising these restrictions for the daughter-in-law, and what we find that the effect of the co-residence on these close peers in the village are larger when the mother-in-law disapproves family planning, that is the first column, when there is a misalignment in terms of the fertility, in terms of the ideal size of family, for example, in column 3, when the ideal kids of the mother-in-law are larger than the daughters-in-law, or when there are a larger number of sons preferred by the mother-in-law with respect to the daughters-in-law. So our conclusion is the mother-in-law fears that the outside peers may influence her daughters-in-law outcomes of family planning use and then deviate from her own preferences. And also we find that the effects are stronger when the husband also disapproves of family planning and when he is a migrant. So these peers are important because they influence the women's family planning outcomes. So as you can see in this table, these are OLS estimations. The larger number of close outside peers increases the likelihood for a daughter-in-law to go to visit the family planning clinic, to use mother contraception, to believe that there are more users of family planning in her own village, or to be allowed to visit a health facility with someone. So the mobility restrictions imposed by the mother-in-law and the lower number of close peers might have an additional detrimental impacts on her daughter-in-law in terms of this access to health clinics and contraceptive choices. So in the second part of the paper, we do an instrumental variable estimation where we are interested to measure the effect of the mother-in-law through the close outside peers on the daughters-in-law health outcomes. So in order to do so, we instrument a woman's close outside peers with the interaction of two variables. One is the fraction of women in her village who belong to her caste group, which is defined here in the third equation. And we interacted with the co-residence for mother-in-law. And what we find is that this interaction seeks to capture the constraints imposed by the mother-in-law on her daughters-in-law access to the pool of available outside peers. So we define the first stage as is indicated by this equation. Notice that we are conditioning by community, by village and caste fixed effects. And we show in the paper a lot of details on why this is a robust instrument for a close outside peers. So the most important takeaway of this exercise is that in the second stage and reduced form, confirm our results of the OLS. So then a higher number of close outside peers increases the chances for a woman to visit the family planning clinic, to use modern contraception, although we don't have statistically significant effects. These coefficients are sizable. Also, there is an increase in the beliefs about family planning use, and women are allowed to visit the health facility with someone. So to give you an idea of the size of these effects, we can look at the reduced form, and if we assume that the average value of this proportion or this interaction is around 0.50, the correspondence with the mother-in-law decreases the likelihood of visiting a family planning clinic through the reduction in the number of close outside peers by about 50 percentage points. That is about 50% with respect to the control mean. So all of these results allow us to conclude that correspondence with the mother-in-law restricts her daughters-in-law mobility and ability to form social connections outside the home. These restrictions deprive the daughters-in-law of the beneficial impacts that social networks can have on women's care-seeking behaviors and health outcomes. And these results are informative for policies that want to leverage or aim to leverage social networks to increase women's access and uptake of family planning and reproductive health services. And if women have few close peers, it will be more challenging to reach them and to diffuse information on other policy interventions through their network. So future interventions that aim to reach women will benefit from addressing the gatekeeper role of the mother-in-law into the targeting strategies, or by directly targeting the mother-in-law in a joint family to inform her about the benefits of this type of reproductive health programs. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Catalina. We're now going to have the video presentation for Mahesh Kara. He's from Boston University, and he will be making a presentation on his paper titled Exploring User-Centered Counseling and Male Involvement in Contraceptive Decision-Making, Evidence from a Field Experiment in Urban Malawi. Can we have the video now, please?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mahesh Kar, and I'm an assistant professor at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And this is a study that I'd like to present in collaboration with my student, Keishin Zhang, at the Department of Economics at BU as well, where we explore user-centered counseling approaches in contraceptive decision-making, and we generate this evidence from a field experiment in urban Malawi. So the motivation for this study is that we know that unlike other domains in health, family planning and reproductive health service provision is often a bidirectional process, where unlike other domains in health, where providers tend to be the central focus of information provision and also the provision of care, in the case of family planning and reproductive health, clients have a set of preferences. They often have information that they bring in, and they have a set of preferences for fertility, like ideal family size, desired spacing and timing of pregnancies, and also desired method use, where they may have previous information about methods, and they come to providers with these preferences and beliefs. And the goal of providers is to first understand these preferences that clients have, that clients come with, provide any additional information around the different types of options around contraceptive methods, fertility preferences that they can, to help guide clients to realize and shape their preferences, as well as to achieve their preferences and related outcomes to those preferences, whether they're fertility related outcomes, like spacing and timing of pregnancy, method-related outcomes, like making sure that women are getting the method that they actually say that they want, and other types of outcomes that are related. In this context, we see that the emphasis on the service provision environment has really taken off around the world, where, I mean, one of the indicators of program effectiveness, which is typically contraceptive prevalence, has shown that around the world, globally, contraceptive prevalence has been increasing. The CPR in our study setting, which is Malawi, has been increasing substantially from 46.1% in 2010 to 59.2% in 2016. However, in spite of these increases in contraceptive prevalence, like, the question still remains, which is, are women really using the best methods that truly reflect their both stated as well as realized preferences? And this actually shows that there's a pretty significant gap, because 37% of women in Malawi, for example, discontinue their method within 12 months. And half of these women are discontinuing due to unmet need of family planning, where their method may not actually be meeting their reproductive health needs and fertility goals, as well as method goals. So as a result, frictions may continue to exist in women's realization of their ideal method. This comes all within the context of an ever-growing and important emphasis for family planning programs to provide full, free, and informed choice over methods. And as a result of providing full, free, and informed choice, significant resources since the 1994 Cairo conference have been placed on providing complete information, and particularly complete information over all the set and range of methods that are available to women in their setting. And this approach particularly emphasizes the role of information provision and counseling at the initial family planning consultation. For example, in Malawi, the current family planning counseling practice is that women are first introduced to family planning and reproductive health through group counseling, often at clinics or within their communities, and then it follows up with possible individual sessions with women, where counselors then introduce all possible methods following a flip chart that is actually designed by the Reproductive Health Directorate and Ministry of Health, where each method is talked about in sequence and is ordered actually in terms of method effectiveness. And the aim of this approach is to actually achieve informed choice, where clients are informed about the full range of methods, all possible methods at a time. However, the question is, like, how does such a counseling approach do in helping women actually make informed decisions where they can update their beliefs and preferences, and they can act on these updated preferences? More specifically, to what end are these approaches user-centered? User-centered meaning the client is the focal point of interaction and the key decision maker around her reproductive health decisions, as well as her choice of family planning, whether she decides to use or not, and conditional on deciding to use, which method does she actually end up using? And does she always have the option to change if she so desires? And in order to think about this approach, preferences must be elicited, and outcomes must reflect any updated and elicited beliefs and preferences over family planning and over methods. And examples of this type of approach are the POP Council's Balanced Counseling Strategy, Human-Centered Design, and in the US, My Birth Control. So to test the ideas of user-centered approaches, we develop a field experiment to help women identify and realize their preferences for methods by testing two specific channels through which user-centered counseling might impact the concordance between what women state are their preferences for family planning and what women actually end up doing in terms of their behavior towards family planning outcomes, whether they decide to take up a method or not, and if they do so, which method do they actually end up taking. And we test the channels of male involvement and short-tailored counseling in user-centered counseling approaches to family planning. So the experimental setting, we work in Lilongwe, Malawi, and our study sample is about 782 women, ages 18 to 35. And we hypothesize that short counseling provides women with more salient information, whereas male involvement may provide women with a more supportive environment to help them realize their stated preferences for methods. And what we find as a preview of our results is that women who received the short counseling procedure were slightly more likely to change their ideal method, their stated ideal method over time, but they were less likely to actually translate that stated preference into actual use of that ideal method at follow-up. And as a result, they were likely to be more unsatisfied with their method, their final currently used method at follow-up. On the other hand, women who were encouraged to invite their husbands were less likely to change their ideal method, and they were more likely to switch from their currently used method to another method from counseling. And if they were more likely to switch, they were more likely to actually be able to act on that stated ideal method at follow-up by actually using that stated ideal method at follow-up. However, even though their stated method was more likely to be the same method that they were using at follow-up, they were no more likely to be satisfied with that method at follow-up, suggesting that there may be some interaction between a woman's preferences for family planning as well as her husband's in her final decision-making process. So I will explain the experimental design. So we had a baseline survey, and then we randomized women into 4 arms. And then we gave women the opportunity to go and actually get counseled. And then following the counseling session, we allowed them to go actually act on those preferences by going to a clinic if they chose. And then we did some follow-up with them. So the baseline survey, we did a screening and recruitment of 782 women, a comprehensive survey that elicited fertility behavior, contraceptive preferences, and specifically attribute preferences and rankings of attributes, where we asked the women, if you could, in thinking about a contraceptive method, what exactly are you looking for in your ideal method? Is it method duration, method effectiveness, no need to go for resupply to a clinic? Is it low rates of side effects? Is it the fact that you wanted HIV prevention as well, like dual protection through your method? We asked them about their attributes, and we asked them to rank their attributes. If they mentioned more than one, that was important to them. Following the baseline, we randomized women into 4 groups, and we balanced the randomization. And the 4 groups are, as you can see, are divided as follows, where women were given either standard counseling or a shorter tailored counseling based on the attribute that they revealed was most important to them. And we will also cross-randomize whether women were allowed to invite or encouraged to invite their husband or not. So the husband invitation, as I mentioned, we allow women to choose whether to invite their husband to her counseling session or not. So the woman is given the option to invite her husband or not. And this is quite different from other studies where the other studies actually require implicitly or explicitly their husband to attend the counseling as well, this is quite a different design compared to other studies on male involvement. And then, as I mentioned, with the short tailored counseling, we try to elicit the preferred method attribute and the most important attribute that the woman herself ranked if she chose more than one attribute. And then based on what a woman had chosen as her most important and preferred method attribute, we counsel women on a subset of methods that are aligned with her preferred attribute. Following the counseling, so all women in our study get counseling, but they get a different set of counseling interventions, whether they are encouraged to invite their husbands or not, whether they get a short counseling or the standard of care counseling. And following counseling, we actually allow women to act on their stated preferences, both pre and post counseling. We say to women, now that you have had a counseling session, if you would like to get any family planning services, we give you a 1-month bundle of free family planning services at our local clinic, the Good Health Comma Clinic in Lilongwe. We give them free transport, a free taxi service to the clinic and back. We cover all family planning related costs, and we also give them mobile credit so that they can make appointments with our field manager and the taxi driver to take them to the clinic and back. And the follow-up, at the 1-month follow-up, we follow women, any women who came for services, we ask them about the methods that they received and whether those methods align with their stated preferences and what they said beforehand. If we aren't able to find women at the clinic, we actually follow women up by phone and then also at her home if she does not answer the phone. Our empirical framework is pretty straightforward. We actually just do a straight up intent to treat comparison between women who receive the short versus long counseling and women who receive the husband invitation versus the non-husband invitation. And we're interested as to whether women change their stated method, whether women actually change their use of a method, whether they take up a new method, whether they actually take up the method that they stated that they wanted. And we look at concordance of a woman's use and what she originally stated as her ideal contraceptive method. And what we find is that women who receive short tailored counseling were slightly, but not significantly, but they were more likely to change their stated ideal method from counseling to follow-up by a pretty substantial margin. However, even though they were more likely to change their stated ideal method, so they had changed their preference for methods, they were less likely to be using the stated ideal method to follow up. And because they were less likely to be using their stated ideal method, they were more unsatisfied with their eventual currently used method at follow-up, which suggests that they seem to be relatively unable to act on their changes in method preferences in spite of having increased access to services. So there's some other barrier that is preventing them from actually realizing those stated preferences. On the other hand, women in the husband group were less likely to change their ideal method from counseling to follow-up. They were less likely to change their minds. However, if they changed their minds, they were more likely to switch from their currently used method to another method from counseling to follow-up. And what was interesting is that they were more likely to be using their stated ideal method at follow-up, but even though they were more likely to use their stated ideal method, they were no more likely to be satisfied with that method at current follow-up compared to women who did not have were not encouraged to bring their husbands. Their husbands were always allowed to come, but they were not actively encouraged as part of the intervention. So what we eventually find is that both interventions speak to this thought and this context of user-centered approaches to counseling, where we're trying to think about the enabling environment as well as directly giving women information that might be more salient to them in decision-making. And both of our approaches seek to prioritize women's preferences and move them closer, hopefully, to this goal of having to more full, free, and informed choice. But what's interesting is that neither approach likely gives a strictly preferred outcome. In particular, we find that the short-tailored counseling encouraged women to slightly more freely express and change their preferences over time, but their preferences were not more likely to be realized. On the other hand, encouraging women to invite their husbands translated to a higher likelihood of realizing their stated preferences, but it might have in fact crowded out a woman's expression of her true preferences, where her stated preferences are now conditional on inviting her husband. And as a result, what we actually may be observing is a woman's joint preferences that are taking her husband's presence and her husband's preferences into consideration. Now, whether this is warranted or not, it remains to be seen, but it clearly becomes more difficult to disentangle a woman's true preferences from those of her husband's as well. So what we basically want to leave us with is that there's clearly a need to further explore the trade-off that women face between making independent choices to reflect their preferences, but maybe potentially less able to act on them if they don't have the enabling environment to do so, versus incorporating their partner's preferences to make jointly or socially better off decisions where their partner's decision-making is also considered, but not necessarily individually better off decisions where, if we're thinking about reproductive autonomy and women's rights, women may be making a trade-off in order to be able to act on their preferences, but one where they have to also consider their partner's preferences as well. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mahesh. And we will now listen to the final presentation by Shireen Asaf. She's from the Demographic and Health Surveys Program, and her paper is titled "The Demand for Family Planning Satisfied in Sub-Saharan Africa. Where are interventions most needed?" And as we wait for the video to load, I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions or comments, you can please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. All right, then we're happy to take Shireen's presentation now.
Hello, everyone. So today I'll be discussing with you our paper on demand for family planning satisfied in sub-Saharan Africa and where populations are in greatest need or focus. This is a paper prepared by myself and my colleague, Wenjuan Wang. So So we all know that targeted interventions are needed in order to ensure universal access to family planning and increase demand for family planning satisfied. And it's important to identify the populations and the households where there is greatest need, especially when funds can be limited. So the literature we know establishes that family planning indicators can vary by several things, including region and household poverty, usually measured by the wealth index. This paper attempts to answer whether regional disparities in demand for family planning satisfied exist for women within the same household poverty level. In other words, after controlling for poverty, do we still see regional disparities in family planning outcomes? So the analysis looked at 8 countries with recent demographic and health survey data, and the outcome of interest was demand for family planning satisfied by modern methods. This is defined as the percentage of women who have a met need for modern family planning, or in other words, using a modern method, divided by the total demand. Total demand is the met plus unmet need, and unmet need for family planning is those women who want to become pregnant but are not using a family planning method. The 2 main independent variables of interest are the region, or in other words, the region of the country, and a poverty measure. And we used an absolute poverty measure based on 2 criteria, which are related to unsatisfied basic needs and assets. So if a household has 4 unsatisfied basic needs, and these included inadequate water or sanitation, inadequate flooring, insufficient schooling, and no electricity. Now, if the household is asset poor, and this was defined as having no car or truck, which is considered a large asset, or does not have one other small asset, and this is described in the paper in more detail, but for example, a bicycle would be a small asset. The 2 criteria were then combined into 3 categories, the first being non-poor, which is a maximum of 1 unsatisfied basic need. Poor are those households that have 2 or more unsatisfied basic needs but are not asset poor, and then the extremely poor are having 2 or more unsatisfied basic needs and are also asset poor. And the methods include maps showing the level of the demand satisfied for modern methods by region within each poverty level, and then also logistic regressions within each poverty level again, using effect coding for the region variable. Effective coding allows for the comparison of the regions to the overall mean instead of a reference region, as is done with dummy variables. And the controls for the adjusted model were parity, the women's education, and place of residence. So first we start by looking at the overall the level for our outcome, and we see that it ranges from a low of 16% in the DRC to almost 66% in Rwanda. Actually, we see that several countries have a demand satisfied for modern methods as over 50%. And here we see the distribution of the households by the poverty measure, and this also varied greatly within the countries in the analysis. So we see that only 11% of households in Ghana were extremely poor compared to over 70% in the DRC and Ethiopia. And we see some countries with some more or less equal distribution in the poverty, for the 3 poverty categories, such as Zambia, Uganda, and Mozambique, where it's about 1/3 or so. So for our main results, we see that 3 patterns were emerging. And I mean, we with 8 countries, it's very hard to say that there is a pattern, but we detected some patterns. And one was that with limited or no, there was limited or no regional disparities that were apparent. And this was, for example, in Rwanda. Another was that one or few clustered regions stood out from the rest as having lower demand satisfied across all poverty regions. And that was, for example, Nigeria. And the third pattern was that there was more regional variability in just one of the poverty groups. And that's was the lowest poverty group usually. And that's, for example, in Mozambique. So I'll show examples of each one separately. So the first, here is the first pattern, but before I get into the results, I wanted to explain the figures. So here we see the maps and the coefficient plots. And here for the maps, we show the level of demand satisfied for modern methods in each region. And then next to the map, we see the coefficient plots, which show the coefficients for the regression models and the zero line with confidence intervals and the zero vertical line to show where it's overlapping, meaning that it's not significant. So here at the top, we see the non-poor and the poor, and at the bottom, the extremely poor group. For example, here in the first pattern where we see limited or no regional disparities in Rwanda, we're seeing, especially in the non-poor and poor groups, no significant differences from the overall mean. And then in the extremely poor, we see very little. We see 2 regions that are significantly different overall mean, but overall very limited or no regional disparities in demand satisfied across the regions in all the poverty groups. The second pattern was where one or few clustered regions stood out as having lower demand satisfied across all the poverty groups. And an example of this was in Nigeria and the Northeast region. So as we can see, again, here is the maps with the levels of demand satisfied in the regions. Here's the Northeast region. We see here in the regression results that the Northeast region always had lower demand satisfied compared to the overall mean in each poverty group. Another example of this pattern was the Somalia region in Ethiopia, which is described in the paper. The third pattern was where we see more regional variability in one of the poverty groups, and these are usually the extremely poor. And this here, the example I'm showing here is in Mozambique. So again, we see the regional variabilities in the map, and then for Mozambique, we see for the non-poor and the poor, there was no significant regional variations, but in the extremely poor, we see more variability from the overall mean in the regions. And we found that another example of this pattern was in Zambia, also explained in the paper. So some limitations and strengths to discuss. So yeah, the DHS data are household-based surveys. So we don't capture information of groups such as displaced or refugee women that are marginalized group that don't have may have less access to services actually. So the recommendations for areas of intervention should consider these populations. There is also the issue with the small sample sizes in a specific region within a poverty group, which provided less power to detect significant findings. This was especially true when a country had a very skewed distribution for the poverty measure. So if we go back to our figure here, we see that this in Ghana, for instance, in the DRC and Ethiopia, we have very skewed distribution of the poverty measure. And when we start to look at, for example, the extremely poor by region, we start to get to very small observations, and that sometimes created issues with detecting with very skewed estimates. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the selection of the assets for the poverty measure was standardized across the surveys and analysis, can be a strength because it's more comparative. However, the relationship of these assets to household poverty may differ by country and context. But using the poverty measure can help identify households in need. For example, it's easier to identify households that do not have basic needs, for example, no electricity, compared to identifying households from the lowest wealth quintile, for instance. The use of effective coding method to compare to the mean instead of a reference category for the region was also seen as a strength, since the selection of a reference for the region can be arbitrary or based on having sufficient findings to be a reference group. And it's also maybe more meaningful in the interpretation. So in conclusion, the differences in the demand satisfied for modern methods may be associated with differentials in family planning service environment. And this includes availability of the contraceptive methods and the quality of the family planning services that may not be physically or financially available to all women. So another factor is the social and cultural context that may differ from region to region. So even if a woman has access physically and financially to family planning, maybe their social and cultural contacts may be affecting their contraceptive use. So these are some things to consider when taking our recommendations for areas of intervention or where to intervene. But based on our results, we find that interventions may either be required for a specific region, regardless of their poverty level, or for extremely poor households across all regions. But it's always recommended that the DRC receive nationwide interventions because they had disproportionately low demand satisfied for modern methods compared to the other countries, with only 16%. So this helps identify programs of intervention, perhaps more precisely. So that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shireen. And now we will have our discussant comments on each of the papers that we have just listened to. So I would like to call on Shireen again to give us her 5 minutes discussant comments on the first paper that was presented. So that was titled Curse of the Mummy G, The Influence of Mothers-in-Law on Women's Social Networks, Mobility and Reproductive Health in India. Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss this paper. Following the instructions, first to summarize the paper in one sentence. So the paper is examining the influence of the mother-in-law on their daughter-in-law's mobility, social connections, health visits, and family planning use. What I really liked about this paper first is the clever and catchy title, but more importantly, the very thorough analysis and the description of your methods. It was interesting to see the analysis not only on the use of family planning, but the effect of living with a mother-in-law on mobility and the number of peers. This can have consequences that go beyond family planning outcomes. So I see a potential for more papers coming out from this analysis, for instance, effect on maternal health outcomes, such as antenatal care visits is one thing that comes to mind. But there could be, of course, many others. So some points that I wanted to make on the paper. One is, can you see if nationally representative data give the same results at least for the family planning use? Since the paper focuses on one district in rural areas, we don't know how these results compare to other areas or urban areas, just to get a sense of comparing to nationwide. And also, it would be nice to get a sense of the service side in this in the area of your analysis. Are there sufficient family planning services, and also what are the quality of these services? So research has shown that low quality services and low access to family planning services that are nearby can also affect family planning use. So maybe some discussion on that in the future. It would be interesting, my final comment is that it would be interesting to see if possible, and if the data is available, of course, if they're look at the husband-mother relationship and how this affects the outcomes. I know that you have done this already for the husband's view on family planning. However, it would be good to see this for his views on his wife having peers or on her mobility. So in other words, to see if the husband is aligning with the mother more than the wife, more than his wife on, and to see how this affects the wife's outcomes. So those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shireen. I would now like to call on Catalina to present comments on the second paper titled Exploring User-Centered Counseling and Male Involvement in Contraceptive Decision-Making, Evidence from a Field Experiment in Urban Malawi. You'll have 5 minutes. For
Perfect. Should I answer sharing comments and other comments before or no, or just now?
Not yet. You'll have a chance to do.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna share very quickly it's a very short presentation on, please let me know if you are seeing my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
So you are seeing, okay, sorry. So you are seeing now these slides, right? Yes, okay, perfect. In the presentation mode or not?
Not yet in presentation mode.
It's not in presentation mode, okay. Just let me, sorry. Let's see if I can, if not, I will just present it the way that it is. If not, I will just, I don't want to delay okay, share screen too. Okay. Are you seeing now the presentation mode? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So thanks for sharing this paper. I had the opportunity to read this very nice experiment that was run in Malawi by Mahesh and co-authors. I will just summarize the paper very briefly. Mahesh was very clear in just telling us that the paper uses an experiment to test two main components of an intervention based in youth-centered counseling to help women identify and realize their family planning preferences. This is in urban Malawi. Is key the youth-centered approach because a woman is a focal point of interaction and a key decision maker. So there are two main things that the paper does is first focus on the concordance between family planning state and reveal family planning preferences and how these translate into contraceptive use. And I think that this is one of the major contributions of the paper. And second, it explores two channels through which the youth-centered counseling can impact this concordance. One is male involvement and the other is short-tailored counseling. So what we will see here is just are you seeing now the main findings? I'm gonna go very briefly just to put us in the same mindset. women in the short targeted counseling intervention were more likely to change their state ideal family planning method over time, but less likely to use the state ideal family planning method at follow-up. Women in the male involvement intervention were less likely to change the ideal state method, more likely to switch their current method, but then more likely to be using their state ideal method and follow us. So what was surprising is that in both interventions, women were more likely to be unsatisfied. And I think that this is one of the most interesting things. So some comments and questions, and Mahesh, please disregard details, but one interesting thing that it will be useful to see is what is women's baseline knowledge of this entire set of choice of family planning methods and baseline. Is this knowledge balance across arms? I think that that will be important, and you can further explore this short counseling. It's not only about the timing, it's just about that you are doing some decrease in the, you are decreasing the set of choices, you are doing some framing. So there is a lot of behavioral components that might be exploit. And then do you have information of the rankings of family planning over time? You can report by methods this switching over time. That will be important. And just, we didn't have the chance probably to see in the presentation the regressions, but Mahesh is independently running the male involvement and the short term intervention. So it will be interesting to see the three treatments in the same regression, just for you to have like these differential effects of husband invitation and short counseling. And I am aware that might be power issues, but it will be informative for your results. It's surprising for me why women didn't change the ideal state method with the short intervention. I don't know if you can get at something by heterogeneous effects of traditional mother baselines at line. Also, between this male involvement story, it will be interesting to see differences in fertility preferences between husbands and wives, right? And I'm just curious, will this change over time, right, due to intervention? That I think that we will, we will be curious to see. And also other issues of bargaining power. I think that they are crucial to understand what are the effects of male involvement. And more broadly, it will be interesting to discuss implication of differences between stated and revealed family planning preferences for women's welfare, why we do care, right? I think that that is one issue that we can discuss with the attendees in the session, but I think that this is important. And will the male involvement results suggest that negotiation is a potential avenue to include men in the family planning conversation? We don't know, right? Because you kind of design it in a way that where women inviting their husbands, right? So that should we be preceded by some sort of negotiation, right? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's something that we can discuss. And I will advise that probably the current paper, the way that it stands, can be divided into kind of two papers, depending on how you advance with the main findings. It's a very nice paper, very innovative. So thank you for the opportunity to comment it.
Thank you very much, Catalina. I'd like to now ask Mahesh to present, discuss, and comments on the third paper, Demand for Family Planning Satisfied in Sub-Saharan Africa, where are interventions most needed? Mahesh, you have 5 minutes to do this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm also going to quickly share my screen, if that's okay. Can everybody see the screen with the slides? Is that okay?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Great. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to discuss Shireen's paper. This paper actually resonates a lot with me because this speaks to some analyses that I actually did quite a while back with Karen Forright, about 11, I don't know how many years ago, looking at exactly some of these questions, but Shireen has done a much more comprehensive analysis with sub-Saharan African countries, where you're looking at place of residence and you're looking at wealth as well as by place of residence in the context of region. So just to quickly summarize a couple of the key points is that the main objective of this paper is to look at regional variation and the association between household poverty and demand satisfied from modern family planning methods, DSMM. And Shireen and her co-authors look at DHS data from 8 sub-Saharan African countries between 2013 and 2016. And the key outcome in the models, and I'm not presenting any of the models here, but the key outcome is demand satisfied for modern methods, which is essentially just the fraction of met need or modern contraceptive use divided by the total demand, which is met need plus unmet need. And the key variables of interest in this analysis are region and poverty. And the poverty metrics, which is and this is actually, I think, has already been brought up in a couple of the Q&As for Shireen, is like this new measure and metric of poverty, and how this metric is possibly where there may be comparative advantages of this method in this analysis relative to, for example, the standard wealth quintiles that and the asset measures that are often used in a lot of the analysis for DHS. And the poverty measure is essentially generated from 4 different metrics of basic needs: water, floor, schooling, electricity, and then also a metric of asset poverty. And then you combine them together in a decision tool to say, how do you categorize households as very poor, poor, or non-poor? And basically the results speak to 2 different types of strategies from a programmatic perspective, where in some countries you would see that you had low demand satisfied for modern methods in some regions, but across all poverty groups, which implies that there seems to be like low family planning service provision in those regions. And so the region-based targeting makes sense because it's affecting, like, there's just low service provision environment across the entire region. And in other countries and in other settings, you find that there's low demand satisfied in some poverty groups across all regions, which implies that there's a poverty targeting strategy that needs to maybe be considered across the entire country. So the ways in which these implications of these findings mean for targeting and for service provision, or strengthening the service provision environment, is what the implications are of this study. A couple of questions. Like, so I think that you had some really, really cool GIS maps, and you've done a lot of nice spatial points, but I don't think in the latest version of the paper that I saw online, I'm sure you've run the regressions, but it would be nice to see what they actually look like in the tables and what some of those point estimates looks like, because the thing that was a little confusing to me is what exactly is a unit of analysis? Is it the household on one side, or is it the region? And if it's the region, then there's likely to be a sample size issue because you have only 8 countries multiplied by maybe 10 or so regions. So you're maybe getting power issues, which is why you may see some of those confidence intervals be so wide when you were breaking down some of those estimates. But if it's at the household or the woman level, then there might be actually enough sample. But then I'm not sure exactly how you're calculating the outcome, because the outcome is like a population prevalence, like it's a population metric. So having some of the regression tables at the end might be helpful for better inference. I'm going to bring up a couple questions which are actually much more generalizable to the DHS, and I think a lot of people in the space have discussed this at length, but just to make sure that it's comprehensive. The outcome of demand satisfied and unmet need, I mean, we're using DHS, incredible resource, really great data, but of course limited in certain ways, particularly when we are trying to think about disentangling demand from the unmet need. And again, I think this was also brought up in your discussion, was around you're focusing on modern methods. But in sub-Saharan Africa, there's also quite a lot of variation in the use of traditional methods. So I'm wondering how robust your analysis would be to thinking about like demand satisfied for any method rather than just modern methods. Because if it's you may want to conduct like a sensitivity analysis to include and not include traditional methods. And this actually could speak to the kind of work that I've been doing, which is on contraceptive concordance. Because women are actually saying that they really do want to use traditional methods. They understand those methods, and they're actually meeting their need with those methods. And it actually may be an okay outcome, even though we tend to focus a lot on modern methods. And I think this speaks to a broader metric that I'm sure that you will have a lot of point to say, which is thinking about a metric in the DHS for concordance more than just necessarily the use, which is actually what you're getting at, which is going to get at the concept of demand satisfied. I think this was already asked, the first question was already asked in the discussion, so I will not go there other than to follow up and say that if this new poverty metric, because you're trying to find more comparability across different countries, where in some countries the wealth score may be weighted more towards certain types of assets than in other countries, if the correlation is high across countries, then it actually might be okay for the analysis to take in the wealth quintiles, traditional as it may be. But if there's a really not a very good correlation across countries, across these poverty metrics compared to the wealth score, then you may want to think about this new, more generalizable metric that you've generated. And then you may want to also think about what these cutoffs mean for like poor versus non-poor, just because there may be sensitivity across the differences in cutoffs, because you're using pretty like rigid cutoffs, and to say like if you're asset poor, then you may be considered to be poor, even if you have those other metrics satisfied. General question for family planning, and also thinking about the larger question in development, the discussion around absolute versus relative poverty. This paper really brings into question what should be the metric. And the last thing to say is the correlation between wealth and place of residence, because a lot of the assets in the DHS are directly correlated with more urban versus rural areas. So implicitly, by comparing poor versus non-poor areas in using DHS assets, you are comparing urban to rural. So I'm guessing that a lot of, I mean, you can even see these in the maps that you generated, a lot of the places where you're seeing like pretty, like where the non-poor samples are like likely to be high are all the places like in DRC, for example, in Kinshasa, and in the urban areas. And so like essentially this is likely to be very correlated with place of residence. So being able to disentangle the poverty from the place of residence, I think might be next way to go. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for these very comprehensive comments, Mahesh. At this point, I would like to hand over to Marlene Lee from the Population Reference Bureau. She's going to be moderating the Q&A session. And Marlene, so you're welcome. I'm handing over to you now.
Thank you very much. Could I ask every attendee, just as a brief test, to raise your hand so I can see if I can see you when you raise your hands? Oh, great. I can see raised hands. I am going to ask Catalina to address the questions that she was able to see. And instead of me repeating it, you can just say what question you're addressing. And I'm going to ask the attendees if they have other questions for Catalina to raise their hands so that I can pull you out to talk to her. Okay, go ahead. You're muted.
Thanks, Marlene. Should I answer also, Shireen, questions or later on?
Oh, yes, the discussant questions, yes, as well
okay,
as the
so thanks a lot for your questions, sharing and comments. I think that we agree the work on the national representative data is something that is upcoming more because we have like this broader project of what is the influence of the mother-in-law in different, economic and social outcomes. So this is something that we are working on. In the survey side, we collected information about 28 villages, and we have around 10 clinics, 10 family planning clinics in that area. But this is a baseline of our randomized control trial for which we chose family planning with high quality services. So more results on that regard of how quality of access, affects this relationship. It's something that we will be analyzing with the experiment. So you are right, right there, trying to pose the questions that our ongoing research is trying to address. And then it's very interesting what you said about the husband and mother-in-law relationships. So we have only for some sort of fertility preferences, but now that we have this ongoing project and we would like to go back to these households, I think that this is one key component of this relationship between daughter-in-law and mother-in-law. So thanks a lot for your comments. So there was a comment, I think that the person left, but there was a comment about the robustness of the instrument. So we remember that we are instrumenting close outside peers with the interaction of the co-residents of the mother-in-law, and this proportion of friends who are on the same caste and the same village that are 18 to 30. So there are two conditions that we need to analyze when it comes to instruments. The one is the first stage, and the second is the exclusion restriction. We show in the paper that this interaction is highly correlated with our instrument. So it has good predictive power. The F-stat is larger than 10. The reduced form also validates, the relevance of this instrument. And also the identifying assumption comes because we are conditioning on the socioeconomic characteristics of these women, such as caste, some empowerment measures as well. and the caste and village fixed effect. So basically, we are identifying, the variation comes from two women in the same caste and in the same village if they reside or not with the mother-in-law. And the exclusion restriction will be violated if there is some unobservables that are affecting, that the instrument is affecting the final outcome. And we do some series of robustness checks. It's very complicated to, kind of rule out all the type of exclusion restriction issues that might be, but in the paper, and we are happy to share more information if it is possible, we do placebo tests, like the instrument should not be affected the firstborn child's sex, right? The instrument should not be affected, for example, the mother's education. So all of these tests are, are reassuring. And as I mentioned in the talk, we do the quiescence of the mother-in-law is what might be endogenous and selective.
Catalina, can I have
issues.
one last comment?
Yes, yes, of course.
No, do you have one last comment? We need to move on.
Yes, no. So that was on the issue, and I think that I can talk later to Nikki about the endogeneity also of the selection. So if I don't have time, I don't want to, to interrupt others.
Thank you. Just in case people have to leave, I would like to ask Shireen if she has a couple of questions. I think Mahesh helped clarify understanding, but if you could just say what question you're answering and then go ahead and answer.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mahesh. That was a very nice summary of the paper, and did point out the main limitations that are coming from this analysis. And from one of your questions was the unit of analysis. So it was the woman. And we did exclude women that we wanted to get more about not just their contraceptive use, but take into account their need. So yes, I know that this is usually a population measure, but we did use it as at the unit of analysis at the women's level. So I think maybe for the other questions, I can answer those later if we're running short on time, or do you want me to go on?
Could you just, for me, since it was my question, clarify a little bit about what you, the policy relevance, what you took away as the policy relevance and targeting from your results?
Yeah, so this touches on one of Mahesh's questions on why we use this measure. So as you know, the wealth index is not comparable across countries or from one survey to another for the same country. So we were trying to look at other poverty measures, and this is why we constructed this poverty measure. So trying to see how the interventions should be targeted, and as Mahesh was describing, whether it should be really focused on a certain region or the certain group that across the whole country. So that was the main motivation in the paper.
And the conclusion?
Well, yes, I mean, with 8 countries, we should probably do this for more countries to say there are patterns, but mainly it really is country specific. So some countries, they needed nationwide interventions, and some really needed a focus on one country, especially if funds are limited. Maybe these kind of analysis can really highlight where interventions or where funds should be really focused. Should it be focused on one specific region, or should we look at households that are more economically disadvantaged?
All right, thank you very much. And Mahesh, you've answered some of the questions already. I let you have one last point, short point.
Yeah, totally. So I think, I know it's very hard for me to be short, right, Marlene? So I think, Catalina, you and I have had a chance to discuss this, so thank you so much. You're right, the main reason why I did not present the interaction analysis, because it was a 2x2 factorial, is because in our pre-analysis plan, we did not think we would have power. We will present them as suggestive evidence, but we will stick with our protocol and make sure that we are caveating all of those results. I think, Shireen, you had a question about provider characteristics. So this is something which we actually have data for that we're going to dig into a little bit more. For us, all of the women were encouraged to go, if they wanted to go for free family planning services, our partner clinic, we chose that clinic because it was known to be the highest quality clinic in the area where our catchment areas are being served. So we're kind of controlling for the supply side to see what the demand responses would be, because this clinic, which is a PSI social franchisee clinic, had like the full range of methods, high quality counseling, like insertion removal services, including including for clinical methods. Like, so there was the supply side was more controlled for, and we wanted to see how do women continue to make choices in the face of having full possible options and choices across methods. So that's what that's what that looked like. There was one question around the reproductive autonomy and male involvement, and that's an ongoing debate. And I think that was one of the motivations for this entire study, which is like thinking about like this ongoing tension and balance between contraceptive autonomy, which really harbors and brings back, you know, the motivation of 1994, the Cairo Conference, and the focus of women's reproductive rights. And also this ongoing like tension to think about to what extent do we involve men and male involvement in family planning, particularly in very women-oriented spaces. That's something which I'm happy to talk about in the session. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to thank all the authors. This was really interesting. The participants can join the authors in a Meet the Authors session. And you can get there by going to the wonderful hub that looks like you're not confusing lobby and clicking on live on demand sessions. And there's a link for Meet the Authors. Nkechi, final word?
No, just to thank everyone for their contributions, the speakers, the audience. Thanks for making this a really, really great session. So without much more hesitation, let's move on to the other meeting to meet the authors. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.